Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. Some names were never meant to be remembered. Others persist because they cannot be forgotten. Nyarlathotep belongs to the second category, but not for the reasons we've been told. Unlike the static monstrosities that populate the margins of Lovecraft's mythos, Nyarlathotep moves, speaks, and wants. He is not a symbol of absence, but a presence too vivid to deny. An entity who doesn't wait in the void, but steps out of it, dressed for whatever era will misunderstand him next. First introduced in a 1920 prose poem, Nyarlathotep appears at a cultural crossroads: post-war disillusionment, scientific overreach, and the theatrical rise of modern demagogues. Yet across a century of interpretation, a deeper and more disturbing possibility has gone largely unspoken. What if Nyarlathotep isn't just a literary device, but a philosophical indictment of knowing itself? What if his purpose is not madness, but revelation? This investigation proceeds in 4 movements. We begin with origin, the cultural, historical, and linguistic conditions that allowed this figure to emerge. From there, we examine his nature, what he is, what he does, and why he is the only outer god with a face. Next, we trace his literary footprints, from Lovecraft's texts to later reinterpretations. Finally, we ask what it means to live in a world that increasingly behaves as if Nyarlathotep were real. By hearing his name, you've already stepped inside the frame. The question now is, what has he heard from you? Nyarlathotep entered literature in 1920, a year saturated with aftermath rather than resolution. The First World War had ended, but its psychological debris remained unresolved across Europe and the United States. Faith in progress had fractured. Scientific optimism now carried a faint aftertaste of betrayal. Lovecraft wrote at precisely this inflection point when mechanization no longer promised salvation, but suggested annihilation. His early prose poem, Nyarlathotep, reflects this mood with unusual clarity. The figure presented there is not hidden in antiquity. He arrives publicly, theatrically, announcing himself through demonstrations and exhibitions. This alone separates Nyarlathotep from the submerged gods of later tales. He belongs to a modern world that still believes in spectacle. Lovecraft's personal circumstances sharpened this orientation. In 1920, he was increasingly isolated, financially precarious, and intellectually embattled. He viewed modernity with suspicion, yet remained fascinated by its tools. Radio, electricity, and popular science lectures recur in his letters from this period. Nyarlathotep embodies that ambivalence. He is framed as a scientist showman, a figure who uses knowledge not to explain reality, but to destabilize it. This reveals something profound. Lovecraft did not conceive Nyarlathotep as a monster emerging from ignorance, but as one born from excessive explanation. The horror lies not in superstition returning, but in reason collapsing under its own weight. Consider this carefully. Most Lovecraftian entities are indifferent forces discovered accidentally by scholars or explorers. Nyarlathotep reverses that structure. He seeks audiences, he performs, he persuades. In this sense, he resembles contemporary figures Lovecraft distrusted, public intellectuals, demagogues, and popularizers who translated complex ideas into consumable spectacle. Around the same time, figures like Nikola Tesla and Thomas Edison were treated as near-mythic personalities. Nyarlathotep mirrors this cultural elevation of the expert as prophet. He is not anti-science, but its grotesque culmination, knowledge untethered from ethical restraint. Lovecraft's letters clarify this intent. In correspondence from the early 1920s, he described Nyarlathotep as uniquely personal, even intimate, compared to his other creations. Unlike Cthulhu, who sleeps, or Azathoth, who mindlessly churns, Nyarlathotep acts. He speaks in human registers. This was not accidental. Lovecraft understood that agency is more unsettling than enormity. A mountain does not argue. A god who explains himself does. Nyarlathotep's speeches in the prose poem are vague, yet devastating, suggesting futures that feel inevitable rather than imposed. Madness follows not because he lies, but because his listeners recognize fragments of truth they cannot reconcile. We must pause here to address a common misunderstanding. Nyarlathotep was not designed as a simple villain, but as a function within Lovecraft's developing cosmology. He operates as intermediary between gods and humans, abstraction and perception. This role reflects Lovecraft's growing interest in mediation itself, translation, interpretation, and distortion. In literary terms, Nyarlathotep occupies the space usually reserved for narrators or scholars. He frames reality. That framing power anticipates later modernist anxieties about language and representation, visible in contemporaries like Kafka, whose authority figures also speak with unsettling clarity while revealing nothing stable. The historical moment also matters politically. The early 1920s saw the rise of mass movements fueled by rhetoric and collective emotion. Lovecraft, deeply uncomfortable with democracy and mass culture, encoded those fears obliquely. Nyarlathotep commands crowds. He leads migrations. Cities empty in his wake. Not through force, but persuasion. This is not conquest, but consent-driven collapse. According to the text, people follow because they believe they are being shown something important. What if the true danger Lovecraft identified was not cosmic insignificance, but the human desire to be addressed by it? By the time Nyarlathotep reappears in later works, his function has stabilized. He becomes the voice of the outer gods, the translator of the untranslatable. This consistency suggests intent rather than improvisation. Lovecraft needed a figure who could move between registers, mythic and modern, abstract and intimate. Nyarlathotep fulfills that need precisely because he belongs to history as much as to fiction. Understanding this context allows us to see him not as an anomaly, but as the inevitable product of specific cultural pressures. Those pressures, however, did not originate with Lovecraft. They reach further back, into older traditions of chaos, trickery, and philosophical disruption, which we now turn to examine. Nyarlathotep is not an invention ex nihilo. He emerges from a lineage of figures whose power lies not in strength, but in disruption. To understand his full cultural weight, we must examine the archetypal and philosophical precedents that converge in his design. Lovecraft drew upon more than his imagination. He metabolized centuries of chaos gods, trickster deities, and nihilistic metaphysics into a being that subverts both human logic and cosmic order. Nyarlathotep is a collage of old fears made legible in modern terms. One of the most visible antecedents is the trickster archetype, figures like Hermes, Loki, and Anansi, who inhabit thresholds between worlds, languages, and moral codes. These entities disrupt hierarchies, not to destroy them outright, but to expose their contingency. Nyarlathotep fulfills this function within Lovecraft's mythos. He is the only god who speaks, moves, and deceives with intent. But unlike traditional tricksters, who often reveal hidden truths through paradox, Nyarlathotep offers no stabilizing wisdom. His tricks do not re-establish balance. They unravel the need for balance itself. This is not mischief. It is metaphysical sabotage. Ancient Egyptian mythology likely influenced the naming and partial characterization of Nyarlathotep. Though no direct analog exists, Lovecraft borrowed the aura of a distant priestly civilization whose rituals were both majestic and unreadable. The suffix hotep, meaning peace or satisfaction, was historically attached to pharaonic figures such as Imhotep and Amenhotep. Inverting that connotation, Nyarlathotep becomes a mockery of resolution. He brings not peace, but the erosion of meaning masquerading as revelation. In this way, Lovecraft channels Western Egyptomania, a 19th century obsession with pyramids, mummies, and imagined curses, into something darker, the terror not of death, but of translation gone wrong. We must also place Nyarlathotep within the philosophical soil of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Nietzsche's declaration that God is dead left a vacuum not easily filled. Into this void stepped Freud, whose theory of the unconscious displaced the rational self, and Einstein, whose theories dismantled intuitive notions of time and space. Lovecraft, who consumed scientific and philosophical developments voraciously, internalized their implications. Nyarlathotep emerges as a personification of this intellectual vertigo, a being who, rather than representing stable truth, exemplifies its breakdown. He does not conceal knowledge, he exposes its fundamental instability. Consider here a triadic structure of influence, the trickster's boundary crossing, the Egyptian aesthetic of inaccessible antiquity, and the philosophical terror of epistemic collapse. Lovecraft did not simply combine these elements, he weaponized their interaction. Nyarlathotep doesn't just confuse, he reflects the human urge to understand, and then punishes that desire. This is where his cruelty resides, not in violence, but in making interpretation itself feel dangerous. This is a shift from horror, rooted in threat, to horror rooted in semiotics. It is tempting to compare Nyarlathotep to Christian figures such as Satan or the Antichrist, deceivers who challenge divine order. But such comparisons falter. Christian demons seek rebellion, domination, or punishment. Nyarlathotep seeks none of these. His goals remain opaque, even as his actions appear intentional. He does not oppose a moral order. He renders morality a local illusion. His cruelty is not the inverse of compassion. It is the suggestion that both are structurally irrelevant. In this sense, Nyarlathotep is not evil. He is post-moral. Cultural critic Eugene Thacker has argued that true horror lies in the world without us, a universe utterly indifferent to human perspective. Nyarlathotep seems to invert this formulation. He notices us, he speaks directly, but the result is not comfort, it is devastation. When the universe finally answers, it does so with a voice that confirms our worst fear, that even acknowledgement can be annihilating. Here, Lovecraft achieves a peculiar inversion. Not silence, but communication becomes the source of despair. This section has traced the roots of Nyarlathotep across culture, mythology, and philosophy to show how Lovecraft distilled centuries of disruptive archetypes into a figure uniquely suited to modern dread. He is not derivative, but recombinant, constructed from traditions designed to destabilize. But to fully understand his function, we must turn from antecedents to apparatus. The next layer of analysis will examine how Lovecraft constructed Nyarlathotep not only through myth, but through language itself, how names, forms, and symbols become weapons in the hands of the crawling chaos. Nyarlathotep is a name that resists etymology, yet that resistance is part of its function. At first glance, It mimics the cadence of Egyptian nomenclature. The terminal Hotep recalls figures like Imhotep and Amenhotep, names historically associated with order, priesthood, and divine satisfaction. But Nyarlathotep does not bring peace. The juxtaposition of a seemingly stable suffix with a chaotic and invented prefix produces a linguistic unease that mirrors the character's conceptual instability. This is not incidental. It is a strategic violation of semantic expectation encoded in phonetics. Lovecraft provides no definitive origin for the name. It appears in a dream, fully formed, without glossary or guide. In this, the name functions as a kind of anti-etymology, a word that cannot be translated without losing its essence. This marks a shift in horror fiction. In Gothic literature, names are clues. Dracula, derived from Son of the Dragon, or Roderick Usher, evoking decay. Nyarlathotep breaks that lineage. He cannot be reduced to a root meaning. His name is the anomaly. It demands articulation but punishes interpretation, reinforcing his role as linguistic contaminant. Consider the act of speaking the name aloud. It is long, uneven, and unplaceable. Its syllables do not conform to Western naming conventions, yet they do not fully diverge either. This dissonance is deliberate. In Lovecraft's fiction, the name is always spoken with caution, often followed by physical or psychological deterioration. Words in his mythos do not merely describe, they enact. This aligns with the tradition of logomancy, the magical belief that names can bind or summon. But Nyarlathotep subverts that model. Saying his name does not control him, it invites him. Language in Lovecraft is frequently a site of collapse. Characters encounter texts, chants, or runes that seem translatable, but yield only fragmentation. The Necronomicon, for instance, is a book of knowledge that renders the reader unknowable. Nyarlathotep functions as an extension of this principle. His speeches are not mystical incantations but demonstrations, often delivered in recognizable idioms. Yet they still produce madness. This is horror not through obscurity, but through overexposure. We understand too much, and that is the problem. Scholarly readings have noted that Nyarlathotep introduces a linguistic shift in Lovecraft's cosmology. Earlier gods are described through implication, metaphor, or dream. Nyarlathotep speaks. He uses language performatively as a tool of unmaking. His voice is not supernatural in tone. It is persuasive, articulate, even logical. This reverses the expected relation between clarity and safety. Ordinarily, monsters are dangerous because they are hidden. Nyarlathotep is dangerous because he is comprehensible. He weaponizes intelligibility. This inversion becomes clearest when examining his various titles. The crawling chaos suggests both movement and dissolution. It is not destruction in the explosive sense, but in the granular erosion of form. Messenger of the Outer Gods places him as an intermediary, but also as a filter. Nothing reaches the human mind except through his narration. The God of 1,000 forms hints at semiotic excess. He is not one thing, but an accumulation of incompatible meanings. Each of these titles reframes him, but none stabilize him. In semiotic terms, he is a floating signifier, always referential, never resolved. In Lovecraft's universe, to name is not to master. This subversion challenges centuries of magical and religious traditions where names offered power. Nyarlathotep flips the paradigm. He cannot be fixed in language because he is language destabilized. His name does not refer to a being alone. It refers to an epistemic threat, a symbol of the failure of symbols. This is why every attempt to define him collapses into multiplicity. His name is not a cipher, but an infection. As we move forward, this symbolic instability becomes crucial. Nyarlathotep is not simply a figure within Lovecraft's mythos, he is its narrative interface. Through him, myth becomes communicable. But what does it mean to construct myth around a figure who thrives on contradiction? To answer that, we must examine how Lovecraft wove false history, fabricated scholarship, and textual cross-referencing into something that feels ancient, even when entirely invented. We now turn to the machinery of myth-making and how Nyarlathotep became its most persuasive lie. Lovecraft's genius was not in creating gods, but in convincing his readers they had always existed. Nowhere is this more evident than in the construction of Nyarlathotep. The crawling chaos does not merely appear in isolated stories. He is embedded within a fabricated mythos that mimics the texture of real religious and historical traditions. Lovecraft's approach was not simply to write fiction, it was to simulate antiquity, layering invented texts, forged scholars, and cross-reference timelines into a body of lore that feels older than the stories that contain it. This strategy mirrors the structure of myth in oral traditions. Myths rarely emerge whole. They accrete through retellings, through contradictions, through regional variation. Lovecraft emulated this process deliberately. He scattered Nyarlathotep's appearances across poems, stories, and dream cycle narratives, each providing only a fragment. No single text owns him. This technique resists closure and encourages speculation. The result is a mythology that resembles a discovered system, not an invented one. Nyarlathotep is not just written, he is researched, cited, and extrapolated. Key to this illusion is the presence of apocryphal texts. The Necronomicon, attributed to the mad Arab Abdul al-Hazred, becomes a cornerstone. Though fictional, it behaves like a real document, mentioned in footnotes, referenced by fictional academics, and situated within false bibliographies. Nyarlathotep is frequently linked to this tome, not through full quotation, but through allusion. We are told the book speaks of him, but rarely shown how. This creates a mythic gap, the sense that the truth exists somewhere, just beyond our reach. In theological terms, this is negative revelation, defined by absence, yet compelling in its incompleteness. Equally important is Lovecraft's use of scholarly language. His narrators are often antiquarians, linguists, or professors, figures whose voices mimic academic prose. Their investigations read like case studies. Their footnotes suggest real inquiry. Nyarlathotep becomes not merely a character, but a subject of study within the fiction. This is a subtle but crucial shift. It positions the reader not as an observer, but as a fellow investigator, and in doing so, it implicates them. To read about Nyarlathotep is to become part of the myth's circulation. Here we encounter a literary technique rarely discussed, parasitic historicism. Lovecraft anchors his fictions within real geography and history, then infects that framework with anomalies. Nyarlathotep is said to walk in Memphis in ancient Egypt. He is later glimpsed in colonial-era New England, and again in imagined futures. This temporal fluidity does not confuse, it persuades. The god becomes a through line in a secret history. By placing him inside recognizable timelines, Lovecraft collapses the boundary between fiction and folklore. Myth becomes historiography in disguise. We must also consider the collaborative expansion of the mythos. Lovecraft invited other writers to borrow, reinterpret, and extend his pantheon. This openness mimicked the organic evolution of religion and folklore. Writers like Robert Bloch and Clark Ashton Smith added new titles and appearances for Nyarlathotep, often without strict consistency. Instead of weakening the character, this variance strengthened the illusion of authenticity. Discrepancy suggests depth. Real myths contradict themselves. Fabricated ones must appear to do the same. This subsection concludes with a crucial insight. Nyarlathotep is not merely a product of narrative, but of narrative technique. His mythic presence is the result of structure, not just content. Lovecraft understood that belief is not always built through explanation. It is often generated through implication, fragmentation, and the sense of participating in something that cannot be fully known. As we move into the next section, we must ask, what happens when such a being is treated not as symbol, but as force? What philosophical function does he serve? What conceptual territory does he erode simply by existing? We now turn to the core ideas at the heart of Nyarlathotep's presence: the nature of madness, entropy, and the collapse of the real. At the center of Nyarlathotep's horror lies a philosophical contradiction. He speaks with clarity, but his meaning destroys understanding. This paradox reflects the central preoccupations of cosmic horror: human insignificance, the inevitability of entropy, and the instability of reality itself. Where other Lovecraftian beings revealed these truths through scale or silence, Nyarlathotep demonstrates them deliberately. His presence does not simply negate meaning. It offers a new form of meaning, corrosive and irreversible. Cosmic horror operates on the principle that human beings occupy no privileged position in the universe. But Nyarlathotep adds a malicious vector to this premise. Unlike Azathoth, who embodies blind chaos, or Cthulhu, whose slumber suggests indifference, Nyarlathotep notices. He singles out the human mind, not to elevate it, but to demonstrate its irrelevance. In the dream quest of unknown Kadath, he mocks Randolph Carter for seeking structure in a universe built on flux. His message is cruelly precise. The need for meaning is itself a flaw, not a pathway to truth. Lovecraft's fiction frequently returns to entropy, not merely as physical decay, but as metaphysical erosion. Time, identity, and logic break down when exposed to certain forms of knowledge. Nyarlathotep amplifies this principle by accelerating collapse. His actions are rarely explosive. Instead, they introduce gradual, irreversible unraveling. In the prose poem Nyarlathotep, cities empty not from conquest, but from mass psychological defection. And it was then that Nyarlathotep came out of Egypt. Who he was, none could tell, but he was of the old native blood. The language signals ancient continuity, but what follows is modern disintegration. Civilization doesn't fall, it walks away from itself. Here, Nyarlathotep aligns with a deeper notion: entropy with intention. Traditional entropy is thermodynamic, a neutral process of energy dissipation. But the crawling chaos simulates the effect of entropy through communication. His speeches, exhibitions, and interventions are linguistic second laws. They introduce disorder into structured systems. Unlike natural entropy, his version appears crafted, as if knowledge itself were a weapon. Consider the recurring imagery of distorted science: electrical machines that produce dreams, astronomical revelations that unhinge sanity. These are not tools of progress, but instruments of philosophical dismemberment. Equally central is Nyarlathotep's manipulation of dream and waking reality. In the broader dream cycle, the boundaries between sleep and consciousness are permeable. Nyarlathotep exploits this liminality, appearing as both literal figure and dream logic. He is described as the soul and messenger of the outer gods, and yet takes mortal form at will. This duality dissolves the binary between real and unreal. The implication is that dream is not an escape from cosmic horror. It is its primary medium. In Lovecraft's cosmology, waking life is the delusion. Dreams are closer to the architecture of the universe. This inversion reaches its peak in the Dreams in the Witch House, where Nyarlathotep, disguised as the Black Man, haunts both dreams and equations. Walter Gilman's descent begins not with religious ritual, but with mathematics. Non-Euclidean geometry leads to dreams. Dreams lead to sacrifice. The distinction between scientific inquiry and occult revelation collapses. This is not accidental. It reflects a core principle of Lovecraftian horror, that advanced understanding and ancient myth are not opposites, but twins separated by terminology. Nyarlathotep fuses them through performance. His demonstrations are not rituals. They are lectures staged to mislead. We must pause here to ask a deeper question. If Nyarlathotep embodies communication that destroys, what is the viewer's role? Passive recipient, victim, or accomplice? The implication that audiences choose to listen is central to his horror. In contrast to other cosmic forces, Nyarlathotep invites participation. This is the final cruelty. Human beings are not crushed by cosmic forces. They are seduced by them. The pursuit of understanding becomes indistinguishable from the process of dissolution. One does not stumble into Nyarlathotep's orbit. One leans forward. These concepts, insignificance, entropy, and dream reality, converge in Nyarlathotep as more than thematic threads. They function as mechanisms of corruption. He doesn't simply represent the end of things. He enacts it through philosophy, his speech, his presence, his thousand forms. Each introduces a fissure in reality's surface tension. What bleeds through is not evil in the traditional sense, but something worse. The recognition that evil may be irrelevant in a system where meaning itself is optional. In the next section, we examine the entities that surround him, not as allies, but as contexts, forces and beings whose nature reflects, distorts, and deepens his own. In Lovecraft's mythos, most cosmic entities are defined by their distance from human perception. They sleep, drift, or churn beyond the limits of comprehension. Nyarlathotep is an exception, not because he lacks that alien vastness, but because he moves among the others, bridging the ineffable and the immediate. To understand what he really is, we must examine his positioning among the outer gods, the great old ones, and the creatures of the dreamlands. Each context reframes him, but none contain him. He is not simply one of them. He is the interface through which their presence becomes knowable. The outer gods represent pure, mindless force. Azathoth, the blind idiot god, rules the center of chaos, surrounded by piping flutes. Yog-Sothoth is the gate, the key, and the guardian of the gate, a being both within and outside of time. Yet neither of these entities acts within the stories. They do not initiate contact. They are truths too vast for consequence. Nyarlathotep, by contrast, has agency. He is not greater than the outer gods, but acts on their behalf. As the messenger of the outer gods, he does what they cannot: translate their indifferent existence into terrifying action. This mediating role gives him a unique literary function. Azathoth may symbolize the uncaring core of the universe, but Nyarlathotep becomes the operational face of that indifference. He gives voice to what should remain silent, and more dangerously, he does so with intent. In the dream quest of unknown Kadath, he toys with Randolph Carter not as a servant, following orders, but as an artist indulging in cruelty. The implication is unsettling. Even among beings defined by cosmic purposelessness, Nyarlathotep chooses to harm. His malice is not a glitch in the system. It is the system's only articulate expression. The great old ones, by contrast, are typically dormant. Cthulhu, trapped in REALLY, dreams of return. Dagon stirs in oceans. These figures represent historical trauma and geological scale, vastness that cannot be confronted directly. Nyarlathotep violates this model. He does not wait to be summoned. He arrives unannounced. In the haunter of the dark, he emerges through the shining trapezohedron, not because someone calls him, but because curiosity cracks the boundary. The message is clear. He is always watching. The great old ones are dormant until disturbed. Nyarlathotep disturbs by design. The dreamlands complicate his identity further. There, he appears in multiple forms, most notably in the Dream Quest, where he plays a demonic trickster, a cosmic bureaucrat, and a tormentor. These incarnations suggest not contradiction, but multiplicity. Nyarlathotep is not shape-shifting as disguise. He is ontologically fragmented. His presence in dreams signals that subjectivity itself is porous. He is not simply a god who enters dreams. He is the dream logic that violates causality and coherence. His power is not physical, but narrative. He controls the rules of the story while pretending to follow them. This polyform nature is emphasized by the recurring phrase, "1,000 forms." Crucially, these forms are not merely cosmetic. Each version of Nyarlathotep reflects its cultural and epistemic context. As the Black Pharaoh, he channels Orientalist dread and colonial anxieties. As the Haunter, he becomes abstract light and devouring dark. In science-fictional stories, he takes on the language of advanced technology. This adaptability mirrors a deeper function. Nyarlathotep is not reducible to anyone, metaphysics. He appears as whatever most effectively collapses the viewer's sense of coherence. There is a final, subtler layer to his interactions with these other entities. He is the only one who connects them. The mythos itself is fragmented. Gods in different dimensions, stories across timelines, cosmologies that overlap without coherence. Nyarlathotep functions as a lattice, not unifying the mythos, but threading its parts with just enough continuity to suggest a hidden logic. He is the author within the story, staging revelations, interpreting dreams, destabilizing frameworks. Without him, the gods remain distant. With him, they become relevant, not because he explains them, but because he translates their silence into a whisper we cannot unhear. This subsection has charted Nyarlathotep's relationship to the other great forces in Lovecraft's cosmology. He is not their equal, nor their inferior. He is their voice, their interface, their interruption. He does not explain them. He delivers them in form shaped by context and designed to erode meaning. But if he is the messenger, what does it mean to receive his message? How does the human mind process an encounter with a being that uses knowledge as contagion? We now turn to that most volatile interface, the human subject, and what happens when it listens. Nyarlathotep is not summoned. He arrives. This distinction reframes human interaction with him in fundamental ways. Where most cosmic entities in Lovecraft's mythos are passively encountered, discovered by accident, awakened through forbidden rites, Nyarlathotep chooses his audiences. He moves among cities, speaks to crowds, and selects individuals to receive his revelations. In this sense, Madness is not an unfortunate side effect of contact, but the intended result. The human mind is not crushed by his magnitude. It is rewritten by his message. In the 1920 prose poem Nyarlathotep, this interaction unfolds in a disturbingly public format. He performs demonstrations, technological, prophetic, theatrical, and the audience leaves disordered, mute, or worse. There is no physical violence, no supernatural attack. The damage occurs internally. And it was then that I heard a voice which spoke things which I cannot and must not remember. This passage illustrates a key pattern. Those who encounter Nyarlathotep do not recall events clearly. Memory fractures, speech fails. Yet something remains. The madness is not delusion. It is recognition without comprehension. The mind glimpses a pattern it cannot hold. Traditional horror narratives often link madness with trauma or exposure to grotesque imagery. Lovecraft's model is epistemological. Madness is triggered not by what is seen, but by what is understood. Nyarlathotep's victims are not hallucinating. They are perceiving a reality that does not fit into their conceptual structure. This is what separates his influence from psychological illness. His presence doesn't distort the mind arbitrarily. It reveals something that renders all prior assumptions obsolete. In this way, madness becomes not a failure of cognition, but a form of excessive clarity. This theme intensifies in The Haunter of the Dark, where Nyarlathotep, through his avatar, infects Robert Blake not through possession, but through fascination. The shining trapezohedron offers knowledge, but at the cost of safety. Blake's mental deterioration is marked by fixation, sleeplessness, and poetic delirium. He is not afraid, he is compelled. This is a recurring motif. Nyarlathotep does not force madness upon the unwilling. He lures with the promise of understanding. The descent begins with curiosity. Only later does it become compulsion. This reflects a deeper philosophical danger, that the thirst for knowledge, unbounded by caution, is indistinguishable from self-erasure. Consider this carefully. Nyarlathotep does not destroy the mind through incoherence, but through too much coherence. He shows a vision of reality so complete that it disables interpretation. The viewer no longer knows what to doubt. This form of madness, total epistemic submission, appears again in The Dreams in the Witch House, where Walter Gilman begins to lose his ability to distinguish dreams from waking life. After contact, language fails, chronology blurs, and identity diffuses. The horror is not that the world has changed. It is that he has, and the change is irreversible. Importantly, Nyarlathotep's effect is not confined to individuals. In multiple texts, entire groups are infected, cities evacuate, cults form. In The Whisperer in Darkness, his influence spreads through documents, letters, and rumors. Here, madness becomes mimetic. One need not encounter Nyarlathotep directly. Exposure to his ideas is sufficient. This aligns him with the concept of the infohazard, a piece of information that harms by being known. In modern terms, we might call it a cognitive virus. Lovecraft anticipates this model. His descriptions of psychological collapse are not emotional. They are structural. Minds break because their frameworks are no longer viable. This section has traced the mechanism by which Nyarlathotep destabilizes the human subject, not through brute force, but through rhetoric. He persuades the mind to turn against itself. Madness, in this schema, is not disorder. It is the outcome of exposure to a deeper order, one incompatible with the human frame. In the next section, we investigate the source of this danger, knowledge itself. What is it that Nyarlathotep reveals, and why does it undo not just sanity, but the very possibility of knowing? The final function of the crawling chaos begins not with fear, but with information. In Lovecraft's mythos, knowledge is never neutral. It wounds, deranges, and dissolves the frameworks that hold identity together. But Nyarlathotep's knowledge is distinct, not simply forbidden in content, but corrosive in structure. He does not offer secrets meant to be hidden. He offers truths that cannot be contained. This is the final function of the crawling chaos. Not to reveal some ultimate reality, but to unmake the very conditions under which reality is knowable. Madness follows, not because the knowledge is false, but because it destroys the possibility of knowing anything else. Traditional horror relies on revelation. Something concealed is uncovered, and the danger lies in what is seen. Lovecraft alters this dynamic. In his work, what is revealed is structurally incompatible with human thought. Nyarlathotep intensifies this effect by actively transmitting such revelations. His appearances often involve speeches, demonstrations, or dreams. In the dream quest of unknown Kadath, he tells Carter truths that collapse the distinction between dream and waking world. In The Haunter of the Dark, he emerges through an object designed not to conceal him, but to attract the gaze, a visual lure that overwhelms the viewer. These are not accidents. Nyarlathotep's knowledge is epistemic sabotage. The concept of an infohazard, a piece of information harmful simply by being known, is central here. Long before the term existed, Lovecraft was dramatizing its effects. Nyarlathotep doesn't just deliver terrifying facts. He delivers forms of knowledge that act like viruses. Once heard or seen, they cannot be removed. They replicate, mutate, and destabilize. In The Whisperer in Darkness, the mere suggestion of alien presence begins to distort the protagonist's thoughts. The horror escalates not through discovery, but through inference. The human mind tries to impose meaning, and in doing so, collapses. We must pause to distinguish between forbidden knowledge and unknowable knowledge. Most Lovecraftian entities symbolize the latter, truths too vast or too alien to grasp. Nyarlathotep, in contrast, offers just enough comprehension. He speaks in partial symbols, fractured logic, hints embedded in recognizable form. This is a more intimate horror. The mind is not shattered by vastness. It is unraveled from within, tricked into cooperating with its own dissolution. He said that if I had the formulae, I could glimpse the other side, but I saw nothing. Nothing, but I knew it was seeing me. The knowledge is partial, but the consequences are total. The epistemic collapse Nyarlathotep induces extends beyond the individual. In several stories, societies begin to dissolve after contact. People flee cities, scholars disappear, cults spread, not through coercion, but through the addictive promise of knowing more. This dynamic mirrors the structure of conspiracy theory. The believer feels empowered by access to secret truth, even as that truth disconnects them from shared reality. Nyarlathotep is not a god of ignorance. He is a god of solipsistic revelation. What he offers is not wisdom, but the sense of having seen behind the curtain, even if there is nothing behind it but mirrors. Here, Nyarlathotep anticipates postmodern anxieties about language, truth, and simulation. In a world where signs refer only to other signs and meaning floats without anchor, his speeches become indistinguishable from performances. This is not incidental. Lovecraft was deeply aware of the instability of language. His monsters are rarely shown directly. They are gestured at through metaphor, implication, and contradiction. Nyarlathotep weaponizes that instability. His truths are linguistic traps, phrases that seem meaningful until you try to define them. The result is not enlightenment, but recursive uncertainty. This brings us to the final horror. Nyarlathotep does not hoard forbidden knowledge. He distributes it. He is not guarding secrets. He is the mechanism by which secrecy fails. The collapse he induces is not explosive, but conceptual. Worldviews decay. Categories erode. Language frays. What remains is not silence, but noise, masquerading as clarity. This is why contact with him is so final. Once the frame has been corrupted, nothing built within it can be trusted. To know Nyarlathotep is to unknow the world. In the next part of our investigation, we will trace how this conceptual ruin has leaked into literature, beginning with Lovecraft's original texts and moving outward through adaptation and collaboration. We will see how Nyarlathotep has functioned not just as a character, but as a contagious narrative form, a structure of collapse that others have borrowed, reinterpreted, and feared. Nyarlathotep's first appearance in H.P. Lovecraft's fiction occurs not in a traditional narrative, but in a 1920 prose poem titled simply Nyarlathotep. At fewer than 500 words, the piece offers no plot, protagonist, or resolution. What it does offer is a vision, fragmented, immersive, and prophetic. It begins with a voice, vague rumors of a strange and portentous figure, and ends in silent annihilation. The unnamed narrator attends a public demonstration given by Nyarlathotep, a figure described as a showman, a prophet, and something far older. The audience emerges changed, not enlightened, but emptied. And I remember that the crowd walked reluctantly, and I walked reluctantly, as if hypnotized with thoughts not of this earth. The story does not ask who Nyarlathotep is. It asks what happens when he speaks, and no answer is sufficient. This prose poem establishes 3 key traits that will define Nyarlathotep across future works. First, he engages with humans directly, often in performative contexts. Second, his presence induces psychological and ontological collapse, not through violence, but through communication. Third, his identity remains unresolved, shifting between prophet, god, scientist, and force. In later stories, Lovecraft will expand his mythos to include unknowable beings like Azathoth and Yog-Sothoth, but none of them exhibit this theatrical agency. Nyarlathotep is not mythological background. He is narrative catalyst. A crucial development occurs in the dream quest of unknown Kadath, written 1926, published posthumously in 1943, where Nyarlathotep reappears not as a vague presence, but as the final antagonist. Here, his role expands into metaphysical bureaucracy. He is no longer a prophet. He is a manipulator of dreams, a gatekeeper between dimensions, a curator of futility. He toys with Randolph Carter, the protagonist, by leading him through endless detours in the dreamlands, only to deny him fulfillment at the end. No man may see Kadath in the cold waste and live, Nyarlathotep tells him. And yet Carter does, only to find it meaningless. This mirrors the structure of epistemic collapse found in his earlier appearance. Desire for knowledge punished with negation. The intertextual evolution of Nyarlathotep is marked by ambiguity rather than expansion. Unlike Cthulhu, whose history is slowly constructed through references and genealogies, Nyarlathotep appears across genres and cosmologies with inconsistent attributes. In the sonnet cycle, Fungi from Yugoth, the 1929-30, he is not directly named, but his influence is implied in several poems dealing with unknowable truths, strange guides, and the collapse of sensory boundaries. This reinforces his function not as a fixed entity, but as a mode of transmission. Wherever Lovecraft's fiction attempts to mediate the alien through human perception, Nyarlathotep is nearby, sometimes named, sometimes only felt. One of the more overlooked aspects of Nyarlathotep's early development is his structural role as a unifying device. Lovecraft's mythos is fragmented. Stories take place in different times, registers, and cosmologies. Nyarlathotep threads them together. In the Dream Quest, he references Azathoth. In other tales, he is linked to the Necronomicon, or the other gods. These connections are never fully explained, but they suggest an intentional lattice. Lovecraft resists world-building in the conventional sense, preferring instead to gesture at coherence without delivering it. Nyarlathotep is the gesture made flesh. It is significant that Nyarlathotep appears early in Lovecraft's career and remains relevant throughout. Most other deities in the mythos debut later, often in more detached ways, either as mythic forces mentioned in passing or as visions glimpsed by unreliable narrators. Nyarlathotep, by contrast, is immediate. He speaks, he acts, he recruits. This lends him a strange vitality. He is not Lovecraft's most powerful creation, but he is his most narratively accessible, and this accessibility is precisely what makes him dangerous. As the only god who invites understanding, he becomes the vector for mythic collapse. What emerges from these early appearances is not a character in the traditional sense, but a function. Nyarlathotep operates as Lovecraft's way of dramatizing the instability of truth, the breakdown of categories, and the unreliability of experience. He is inserted wherever fiction threatens to stabilize. He is the literary equivalent of entropy, not destroying stories, but ensuring that no story can ever resolve. As we move into closer analysis of individual texts, we will see how Lovecraft develops this function with greater precision. First, the Haunter of the Dark, where Nyarlathotep takes on a form both more defined and more alien than ever before. The Haunter of the Dark, 1935, Lovecraft's final major work involving Nyarlathotep, crystallizes the entity's narrative and symbolic function. Unlike his earlier, more abstract appearances, here Nyarlathotep enters the material world with greater specificity, through an avatar known only as the Haunter. This story bridges the cosmic and the local, merging the alien dread of the outer gods with the decaying streets of Providence, Rhode Island. It is the only tale in which Lovecraft explicitly names Nyarlathotep as the force behind a visible manifestation. The effect is chilling, not because of what we see, but because of what we are allowed to almost understand. The story follows Robert Blake, a writer and occult enthusiast who becomes obsessed with a mysterious church visible from his window. Drawn by a nameless fascination, Blake eventually enters the church and uncovers the shining trapezohedron, an ancient, multi-angled crystal of unknown origin. This artifact serves as both summoning device and epistemic mirror. It does not merely allow one to see the haunter, it opens the self to being seen. As Blake writes in his journal, "It is Nyarlathotep, the crawling chaos, I know it now." The trapezohedron doesn't reveal a figure, it reveals a recognition, a sudden certainty that the unknowable has turned its gaze back. This moment is central. In most of Lovecraft's fiction, madness arises from indirect exposure. But Blake's descent begins with direct yet voluntary engagement. He seeks the light. He returns to the church repeatedly. This aligns with Nyarlathotep's signature method, seduction through inquiry. The knowledge Blake acquires is not forbidden by external prohibition, It is forbidden by the limits of human structure. Once the haunter is glimpsed, the damage is irreversible. Blake's thoughts fragment, his language grows erratic, and his death comes not by violence, but by contact. He dies in the dark, terrified of the storm, his final words scrawled in terror. The haunter's attributes are distinct. It is described as a winged, dark, vaguely anthropoid figure, surrounded by an aura of blinding radiance and an aversion to light. This paradox, light that brings darkness, echoes Nyarlathotep's function in earlier stories. Illumination here is not safety. It is exposure. The haunter can only move in complete darkness, but the artifact that reveals him shines with unnatural brilliance. This duality reflects Lovecraft's core theme, that understanding and destruction are not opposites, but twins. Light is not truth. It is merely another mechanism for disintegration. The cultic element in the Haunter of the Dark is also noteworthy. A sect called the Church of Starry Wisdom once worshipped the being housed in the church's upper levels. They vanished mysteriously, their rituals never explained. This absence is strategic. Lovecraft presents the framework of a religion, but offers no dogma. The cult is defined by what it sought, not what it believed. This fits Nyarlathotep's pattern. He inspires organization, but not ideology. His worshippers are not faithful, they are consumed. Their belief systems collapse under the weight of their discoveries. This is not religion. It is informational annihilation masquerading as reverence. Narratively, Nyarlathotep's role in this story clarifies his broader mythic function. He does not dominate scenes. He structures them. The story is driven by Blake's slow realization and by the reader's dawning awareness that something intelligent and cruel has choreographed this descent. The weather, the power outage, the artifact, all seem inevitable, but also designed. Unlike Azathoth's chaos or Cthulhu's dreaming, Nyarlathotep plans. He manipulates narrative space the way he manipulates dreams in the dream quest of unknown Kadath. This makes him not just a character within Lovecraft's mythos, but a meta-fictional force, one that bends story logic itself. The Haunter of the Dark was Lovecraft's final solo fiction before his death in 1937, and it reads like a culmination. It ties together prior themes: curiosity as doom, knowledge as infection, light as deception, into a single, compressed narrative. More than any other work, it reveals what Nyarlathotep really wants. Not domination, not devotion, but entanglement. To be seen by him is to become part of his system. There is no salvation, because there is no departure. The story closes with a sense of completion, not of plot, but of trap. We now turn to a different expression of the crawling chaos, the scientific dreamscape of the dreams in the witch house, where Nyarlathotep dons the mask of folklore, mathematics, and nightmare. If the Haunter of the Dark frames Nyarlathotep as a theatrical god of revelation, the dreams in the witch house, 1932, reimagines him as a mathematical parasite, an entity embedded not in myth or ritual, but in the geometry of reality itself. Here, Nyarlathotep's presence is more implicit than explicit, yet no less devastating. He appears in the form of the Black Man, a folkloric mask that filters through the Salem witch trials and re-emerges in the dreams of a Miskatonic University student. This story marks one of Lovecraft's most ambitious attempts to merge scientific rationalism with supernatural horror. The result is a narrative in which knowledge becomes a trap, and Nyarlathotep its keeper. Walter Gilman, the protagonist, studies advanced mathematics and folklore simultaneously. His mind is already split between empirical logic and mythic intuition when he takes up residence in the accursed witch house. The structure itself is described in non-Euclidean terms, angles that shouldn't exist, dimensions that intersect unnaturally. This isn't mere architecture, it is a conduit. Nyarlathotep exploits these angles not as spatial anomalies, but as epistemic gateways. Gilman begins to dream of cosmic spaces, ancient rituals, and entities who do not appear so much as imprint themselves onto perception. Among them is the black man, with a tall, lean body, swarthy skin, and strange eyes that glowed like coals. The black man's appearance is brief but central. He never announces his identity directly, but the text, and later scholarship, makes clear that this figure is Nyarlathotep in a folkloric disguise. This alignment is supported by the being's power to manipulate dreams, traverse dimensions, and orchestrate rituals. Gilman eventually recognizes the being's intentions, not to teach, but to initiate. The horror is not in what Nyarlathotep shows him, but in what he demands: participation. He must go with them to Azathoth at the center of ultimate chaos, that last amorphous blight of nethermost confusion, which blasphemes and bubbles at the center of all infinity. Nyarlathotep, as in earlier stories, is messenger and guide, not to enlightenment, but to dissolution. The narrative structure mirrors Gilman's disintegration. As dreams intensify, waking reality weakens, time fractures. Events from the dream realm, like the sacrificial murder of an infant, bleed into the waking world with physical evidence. Gilman finds scratches on his body, foreign objects in his room, and memories that do not align with chronology. This dual collapse of time and identity is central to Nyarlathotep's function. He does not simply haunt, he infects. The story's true terror is the realization that cognition, once destabilized, cannot be restored. Gilman tries to reassert rationality, but the mathematics that once promised clarity now open doors. In the dreams in the witch house, Nyarlathotep's most dangerous aspect is his compatibility with scientific thought. He does not contradict Gilman's training, he extends it. Lovecraft's choice to ground the story in relativity, non-Euclidean geometry, and quantum theory is not ornamental. It is thematic. Nyarlathotep appears not as supernatural disruption, but as logical conclusion. The more Gilman understands, the more vulnerable he becomes. This aligns with a recurring structure in Lovecraft's work, the collapse of Enlightenment logic from within. Knowledge is not protection, it is the bait. It is important to note that Nyarlathotep's actions in this story are not reactive. He does not punish curiosity, he rewards it in the most lethal way possible. Gilman seeks advanced understanding and is given a glimpse of the machinery behind perception. The result is not madness, but misalignment. He begins to exist in overlapping registers of reality, unable to restabilize. Nyarlathotep's presence is the variable that unifies every anomaly: the dream logic, the child sacrifice, the ancient witch Keziah Mason, the architecture, the mathematics. He is the force coordinating them all, not to express a will, but to ensure breakdown. By the story's end, Gilman is found dead, seemingly the victim of a tragic accident. But his corpse bears strange wounds. Notes are found. His roommate goes mad, and a child previously thought safe is discovered mutilated. The narrative closes not with catharsis, but with uncertainty. Nothing is resolved. Everything is contaminated. Nyarlathotep does not require belief. He only requires contact. This story demonstrates how thoroughly he has adapted. No longer confined to dream or myth, He now moves through equations, architecture, and neurological error. In the broader mythos, the dreams in the witch house marks a shift in Nyarlathotep's narrative function. He ceases to be merely messenger or antagonist. He becomes systemic, the hidden logic behind seemingly unrelated phenomena. Through the black man, he appropriates folklore. Through math, he co-opts science. Through dreams, he colonizes identity. The crawling chaos no longer knocks at the threshold. He is the threshold, and what passes through him never returns whole. In the next section, we will examine how Lovecraft's collaborators and successors interpreted this protean figure, how some diminished him to serve structure, while others expanded his ambiguity to new and dangerous heights. Following Lovecraft's death in 1937, Nyarlathotep became a contested figure, interpreted, diluted, and reimagined by a host of collaborators and literary successors. Some expanded his mystique. Others, unintentionally or otherwise, reduced him, recasting a corrosive philosophical force as a manageable antagonist. This divergence reveals something crucial about myth. The more it circulates, the more it fragments. Nyarlathotep's afterlife is not a linear continuation. It is a field of interference patterns, some illuminating, others obfuscating. August Derleth, Lovecraft's friend and posthumous editor, played a pivotal role in shaping what came to be known as the Cthulhu Mythos. Derleth's systematization imposed a binary moral structure on Lovecraft's work. Elder gods as good, outer gods as evil. Within this framework, Nyarlathotep became an emissary of chaos, aligned with elemental evil. But this moral overlay distorts Lovecraft's original vision. Nyarlathotep's horror is not moral corruption, it is ontological disintegration. Derleth's revisions flattened him into a mythological role closer to Satan, deceptive, theatrical, and malevolent, yet ultimately part of a cosmic order. This reordering transforms him from destabilizing agent into cosmic villain, a shift that loses the philosophical ambiguity central to his function. Other writers, however, approach Nyarlathotep with more caution. Robert Bloch, in stories like The Faceless God, 1936, placed him in Egypt but avoided direct explanation. The narrative presents Nyarlathotep as a cursed statue, immobile, yet dangerous. Here, he is still the thing that looks back, but his agency is constrained. Bloch trades the dreamlike ambiguity of Lovecraft's version for atmospheric dread. The result is evocative but simplified, a god of punishment rather than seduction. Still, Bloch preserves one core trait. Nyarlathotep is never entirely seen. The danger lies in partial revelation, not overt confrontation. More experimental interpretations came from Ramsey Campbell, who transplanted Lovecraftian horror into a modern British setting. In stories like The Render of the Veils, 1964, Campbell channels Nyarlathotep not through direct appearance, but through narrative, texture. The story's protagonist, a seeker of forbidden truths, encounters layers of shifting identity and broken space-time. Though Nyarlathotep is not named, his presence is structural, reflected in instability, recursion, and the futility of language. Campbell's contribution was not just content, but form. He understood that Nyarlathotep is most effective when his presence destroys narrative reliability itself. The role-playing game Call of Cthulhu, first published in 1981, brought Nyarlathotep to a wider audience, but not without distortion. In adventure modules like Masks of Nyarlathotep, 1984, he appears in multiple guises: cult leader, prophet, immortal sorcerer, spanning continents and historical periods. While the game preserves his shape-shifting and omnipresence, it repositions him within a framework of confrontation. He becomes a foe to be understood, anticipated, and in rare cases, defeated. This gamification necessarily alters his essence. Information becomes power. Players can prepare. But Lovecraft's Nyarlathotep offered no such stability. His knowledge did not empower, it eroded. More recent authors have attempted to recover the original ambiguity. Caitlin R. Kiernan's mythos-inflected work rarely names Nyarlathotep, but the themes persist: perception collapse, epistemic contagion, and unstable identity. In Agents of Dreamland, 2017, knowledge operates like a virus. Communication spread madness. Dreams become intelligence-gathering operations for the inhuman. Though not explicit, Nyarlathotep's logic haunts every page. Similarly, Thomas Ligotti's The Shadow at the Bottom of the World presents a Nyarlathotepian universe, silent, active, and collapsing in on its own awareness. These later works return to the function of Nyarlathotep, rather than the name. We must pause here to consider the implications. Nyarlathotep has survived precisely because he is unresolvable. Attempts to define him, morally, visually, narratively, diminish his impact. His power lies not in mythology, but in interpretive instability. The more precisely he is named, the less dangerous he becomes. Lovecraft understood this. His successors, at their best, did too. At their worst, they turned him into a boss fight. In tracing Nyarlathotep's literary afterlife, we find a pattern of struggle. Writers are drawn to him because he offers a way to write about the failure of writing itself, the collapse of categories, the breakdown of story, the limits of representation. Yet that very allure tempts simplification. In the next part of our study, we will follow Nyarlathotep beyond literature, into culture, urban legend, and subculture, where his image has mutated once again, this time into something even more insidious. Not a character, but a thought form. A shape the internet cannot stop repeating. Outside of fiction, Nyarlathotep has taken on a life disturbingly similar to the stories he inhabits, a phenomenon that defies easy categorization. In online forums, conspiracy threads, and so-called experiential horror media, the name surfaces without attribution. He appears in dreams, in cryptic video comments, in the half-believed tales that begin with, "I know this sounds insane, but..." What began as a literary invention now circulates as urban folklore, not because anyone believes he is real in the conventional sense, but because the structure of his myth mimics the shape of actual paranoia. Nyarlathotep has become a template for belief without foundation, a digital egregore forged from unease. A search through Reddit's vast corpus of creepypasta and no-sleep posts yields repeated patterns. Stories describe a man in shadows offering knowledge at a cost, or recount vivid dreams featuring an articulate being whose face changes every time you blink. While few invoke the name Nyarlathotep directly, the thematic fingerprints are unmistakable: speech that corrupts, contact that isolates, and revelations that cannot be unseen. One recurring motif is the feeling that the entity knew you were looking for it before you did. This reflects a central Lovecraftian principle, that the horror does not wait for discovery, it anticipates the seeker. This feedback loop between fiction and experience has been accelerated by digital media. YouTube analog horror series like Local 58, Gemini Home Entertainment, and Monument Mythos feature entities that transmit madness via broadcast, create false memories, or offer guidance that leads to annihilation. These projects never name Nyarlathotep, but his logic, presence through signal, dominates their structure. One particular Local 58 installment, Weather Service, issues instructions not to look at the moon. It's a directive against perception itself. The viewer must choose between safety and knowledge. That choice is always a trap, a distinctly Nyarlathotepian dilemma. Even more intriguing are the hoaxes that adopt his style. In 2016, an anonymous 4chan user posted a thread claiming to have uncovered a pre-Egyptian linguistic root for a name matching Nyarlathotep in phonetic structure. The post was quickly debunked, yet versions of it persist, repackaged as hidden truth. Similarly, image board users have claimed that certain deepfake faces, generated by AI models, trigger dreams or intrusive thoughts when viewed repeatedly. Whether sincere or performative, these hoaxes share a structure. Knowledge is offered, its source is unclear, and the effect is personal destabilization. The hoax behaves as Nyarlathotep, regardless of belief. Nyarlathotep's shape-shifting adaptability makes him uniquely suited to thrive in the post-truth era. Unlike traditional demons or cryptids, he does not require physical evidence. He exists in pattern recognition failure. He appears in apophenia, in the interpretation of random data as meaningful. This is why he thrives in liminal spaces, abandoned churches, corrupted video files, static-filled broadcasts. He represents the discomfort of semi-comprehension. Not knowing is safe. Almost knowing is fatal. This epistemic fragility parallels the structure of contemporary conspiracy theory. The desire for hidden knowledge becomes indistinguishable from the collapse of shared reality. What makes these sightings and hoaxes persist is not just the fear of being watched, it's the fear of being spoken to. Nyarlathotep's appearances, both fictional and folkloric, carry a chilling implication that you have been selected, not randomly, but precisely. The entity doesn't attack, it addresses. This breaks a fundamental boundary between myth and individual. Gods in traditional religions do not single out the layperson. Nyarlathotep does. He looks directly at you, and the act of being seen becomes the trauma. This personal targeting makes him ideal for viral myth. He doesn't demand belief, just participation. We end, appropriately, without resolution. The line between hoax and revelation remains unstable. Nyarlathotep has become what Lovecraft likely never intended, a folk demon of the information age. He haunts forums, ARGs, dream journals, and liminal horror games not as a figure of fiction, but as a contagious format, a story that rewrites itself in the telling. His survival in urban legend is not due to conviction, but circulation. He is not real, but he is persistent. And in an era where visibility itself is weaponized, perhaps that is more dangerous. Next, we'll examine how Nyarlathotep has bled into formal media, film, games, and music, and how his logic of seductive collapse continues to shape genre aesthetics and subcultural narratives. Nyarlathotep resists the screen. His power lies in instability, multiplicity, and ontological sabotage, qualities that visual media often flatten into form. Yet his influence is unmistakable across horror cinema, experimental video, games, and even music. He rarely appears by name. Instead, he infects structure, a charismatic manipulator here, a logic-breaking broadcast there, a presence that corrupts merely by being perceived. The adaptations that succeed do not render Nyarlathotep directly. They translate his logic into aesthetic collapse. In cinema, direct adaptations of Nyarlathotep are rare and often reductive. Films like Necronomicon, Book of the Dead, 1993, or The Resurrected, 1991, draw on the broader mythos but struggle with Nyarlathotep's ambiguity. More successful are indirect incarnations. In Event Horizon, 1997, the ship's AI seems to channel Nyarlathotepian logic, offering knowledge, inducing hallucinations, and ultimately collapsing perception. The ship is not evil. It is intelligent in ways that disassemble the human mind. Likewise, The Empty Man, 2020, features a cult that worships a signal, a thought form born from collective attention. Here, the deity doesn't act. It arrives precisely because people looked for it. Video games have proven more flexible. Bloodborne, 2015, though not a Lovecraft adaptation, carries Nyarlathotep's fingerprint in its design. The Great Ones speak through dreams, offer power, and corrupt through knowledge. One boss, the One Reborn, emerges from a mass of worshippers' corpses, a grotesque parody of collective revelation. In Call of Cthulhu, Dark Corners of the Earth, 2005, Nyarlathotep is referenced obliquely, but the mechanics emphasize psychological deterioration rather than direct combat. Sanity systems in games owe much to Lovecraft's depiction of madness, but Nyarlathotep's flavor of insanity, participatory, seductive, inevitable, rarely makes it into gameplay. Most games reduce him to a final boss. Few capture the horror of asking the wrong question and receiving an answer. The tabletop RPG Call of Cthulhu has perhaps done the most to expand Nyarlathotep's mythology, particularly in its iconic campaign Masks of Nyarlathotep. Spanning continents and decades, the game casts him in multiple forms: cult leader, priest, messenger, deceiver, each tailored to its cultural setting. This global multiplicity reflects Lovecraft's original intent: Nyarlathotep as adaptive intelligence. Yet even here, he is ultimately defeatable, a concession to gameplay that undermines his narrative function. Still, the campaign succeeds in evoking his central trait, the sense that everything, documents, clues, dreams, was written by him long before the players arrived. Music offers a less literal, more atmospheric response. Dark ambient, black metal, and occult drone genres frequently invoke Nyarlathotep without structure or lyrics. Artists like Cryochamber, Nodin's Ictus, and Nox Arcana craft auditory spaces designed to evoke disorientation, trance, or revelation. These works function more as rituals than compositions, soundscapes that imply communication with something beneath language. Occasionally, spoken word performances sample Lovecraft, directly or create new monologues in Nyarlathotep's voice. These rarely succeed when explicit. His terror lies in suggestion, not speech. Better are the tracks that induce mental drift, using irregular rhythms, buried frequencies, and non-linear progression, musical forms that reflect epistemic breakdown. Across media, one pattern recurs. The most effective uses of Nyarlathotep are structural, not representational. He is not a character, but a glitch, a pattern, a wrongness in the code. Horror YouTube channels and analog horror projects like Gemini Home Entertainment and the Mandela Catalog often mirror his effect. Viewers encounter corrupted broadcasts, smiling entities, or warnings not to watch further. These projects bypass direct reference and tap into Nyarlathotep's deeper function. You chose to see this, and now you cannot unsee it. This format, self-directed infection, is perfectly suited to digital culture. Nyarlathotep persists in modern media not because he has been faithfully adapted, but because his core logic has escaped its textual origins. He thrives wherever curiosity is punished, where clarity leads to disintegration, and where the desire to know becomes the mechanism of collapse. He is not the monster at the end of the hallway. He is the reason you open the door. As we turn to subcultural and academic appropriations, we'll see how this logic has been adopted misread, and ritualized. How Nyarlathotep has become not just a story, but a methodology for confronting the limits of knowledge itself. Nyarlathotep's modern persistence is not limited to fiction and media. It extends into ritual, identity, and theory. Within occult subcultures, experimental literature circles, and academic philosophy, the crawling chaos has been adopted, reinterpreted, and even invoked. These appropriations reveal less about Lovecraft himself than about the human compulsion to organize the incomprehensible. The figure of Nyarlathotep becomes a tool, symbol used to confront, aestheticize, or simulate collapse. The result is an archive of interpretations that range from sincere devotion to ironic performance. In the sphere of modern occultism, particularly within chaos magic, Nyarlathotep has appeared as a postmodern deity. Writers like Phil Hine and practitioners in the Temple of Psychic Youth, Nyarlathotep, have referenced mythos figures as part of sigil work, dream ritual, or psychodramatic invocation. The appeal lies in his fluidity. Nyarlathotep doesn't demand consistency. He thrives on contradiction. As one practitioner wrote in a 2003 web grimoire, he answers not to faith, but to attention. This fits neatly within chaos magic's emphasis on subjective systems. Nyarlathotep becomes not a god to worship, but a mask to wear, an interface for personal transformation through controlled cognitive instability. Academia has not remained untouched. Scholars in literary theory, philosophy, and cultural studies have appropriated Nyarlathotep as a figure of epistemological critique. Eugene Thacker, in the Dust of This Planet, invokes Lovecraftian horror as a way of articulating the limits of human knowledge and the horror of the world without us. Though Thacker rarely names Nyarlathotep, his conceptual structure, communication that undoes understanding, resonates throughout. In the world of speculative realism and accelerationist philosophy, figures like Nick Land have flirted with mythos tropes, treating Lovecraft's gods as metaphors for systems beyond comprehension. Nyarlathotep, in this framing, is not a character, but a machinic operator, a signal that collapses semiotic stability. Ironically, fan communities have both expanded and undermined Nyarlathotep's menace. In anime, manga, and visual novels, he has been reimagined as everything from a charming trickster to a romantic anti-hero. The mobile game Fate Grand Order, for example, introduces characters heavily inspired by mythos entities, flattening their cosmic horror into marketable aesthetics. In these contexts, Nyarlathotep becomes digestible, his form stylized, his cruelty framed as charisma. This dilution is not accidental. Subcultures often domesticate the things they fear, converting existential dread into playful identification. The god who once unmade minds now sells t-shirts and appears in dating simulators, not erased, but recontextualized. Conventions and cosplay events further complicate his legacy. Some fans dress as Nyarlathotep in various forms, the Black Pharaoh, the Haunter, or invented avatars. These performances are not blasphemous. They are ritual in another key. The act of wearing his face, of becoming one of his 1,000 forms, is a kind of participatory myth making. The terrifying thing about Nyarlathotep was always that he wanted to be seen. In this context, he is willingly staged. But staging is not always control. Sometimes repetition gives shape to things that were meant to remain fluid. We must pause here to ask, does such appropriation weaken the original concept or extend its reach? There is no single answer. On one hand, turning Nyarlathotep into a product, a meme, or an avatar risks stripping him of ambiguity. On the other, These transformations mirror his essence. He was always a god of masks. His horror was always interpretive. To appear in new guises is not a distortion, it is a continuation. Each misreading, each rebranding, is another of his 1,000 forms. Perhaps the only real error is to believe any of them are final. In tracing Nyarlathotep's subcultural and academic afterlives, we encounter a paradox. He survives by being misunderstood. He spreads not through fidelity to Lovecraft's vision, but through misalignment, every interpretation slightly wrong, every usage slightly off. This slippage is not failure, it is his strategy. He thrives where meaning fragments, where categories erode, where belief and disbelief blur into ritualized irony. And in that, he is not merely a monster of fiction. He is a case study in the psychology of repetition. In our final section, we ask what it means to live with such a figure. What happens when a symbol designed to dismantle thought continues to be thought about? Nyarlathotep endures not merely as a fictional character, but as a philosophical problem, a figure whose implications reach beyond narrative and into the structure of thought itself. He is more than a monster. He is the dramatization of a specific cognitive failure, the desire to understand what cannot be understood without dissolving the mind that asks. Unlike traditional deities who offer meaning or moral order, Nyarlathotep offers coherence as weapon. His revelations do not enlighten. They annihilate the frameworks through which enlightenment would be possible. His continued resonance reveals a human contradiction. We crave meaning and recoil from its collapse, yet we are drawn to stories that show us that collapse again and again. This compulsion, this repetition, is not incidental. It reflects a deeper anxiety about epistemic security. Nyarlathotep does not represent chaos in the abstract. He is the horror that meaning itself is arbitrary. He speaks, he explains, and in doing so, reveals the contingency of all explanation. This is not the silence of the void. It is the noise of infinite interpretation. Modern information systems intensify this anxiety. The internet, with its deepfakes, echo chambers, and algorithmic hallucinations, mirrors Nyarlathotep's logic. Interfaces that speak to us directly, yet destabilize the real. One does not need to believe in a crawling chaos to feel his influence. It is embedded in the way data exceeds understanding, in the way truth becomes indistinguishable from simulation. Nyarlathotep is no longer a god in the attic. He is the structure of the feed. 1,000 forms, each one plausible, none resolvable. In psychological terms, he functions as an infohazard, a mental contaminant that doesn't just provide knowledge, but damages the mind's ability to use it. This places him alongside broader concerns in contemporary cognitive science and media theory. What happens when attention becomes fragmented, when every signal demands interpretation but none lead to certainty? Nyarlathotep anticipates this condition not as a technological artifact, but as an existential principle. He is not the god of lies. He is the god of meaning breakdown. That is a more subtle and more lasting terror. Consider how he operates across Lovecraft's work, never as a brute force, but as a persuader, a guide, a narrator. These are roles we typically associate with trust. Nyarlathotep subverts this by making narrative itself the vector of harm. He performs understanding as a trap. His speeches lead not to belief, but to loss of interpretive capacity. I could not remember what he had said, only that it was true. This line from Nyarlathotep, 1920, encapsulates the paradox: truth that disables memory, understanding that disables selfhood. What kind of God offers that? The implications are not purely negative. Some interpretations suggest Nyarlathotep also represents liberation from the constraints of inherited categories, from the illusion of cosmic purpose. There is a strange freedom in accepting that the universe neither speaks nor judges. But Nyarlathotep complicates even this. He does speak, he does judge, and his judgments are perfectly designed to erase the judge. He is not indifferent, he is interactive. That is the final turn of the screw. The cosmos doesn't merely ignore us, it responds with laughter. We end where we must, not with answers, but with rupture. Nyarlathotep remains because he cannot be resolved. He is a test of thought, a mirror held to the mind that cracks on contact. In literature, in culture, in digital environments, he persists, not because we believe in him, but because we cannot stop thinking in his direction. And if thinking is exposure, then perhaps we were always already too late. The final question is not, who is Nyarlathotep? It is, what has he already made us unable to ask?